The moment Donald Trump returned to the presidency, something shifted in the global order that most people aren't paying attention to. For decades, American presidents could count on a certain deference from world leaders. Maybe not love, maybe not full agreement, but a baseline of diplomatic restraint. That era appears to be over. What we're witnessing now isn't just criticism or the usual back and forth of international relations. It's something more fundamental, a recalibration of how the world relates to American power itself. European leaders are openly questioning American reliability. Asian allies are hedging their bets in ways they never did before. Even traditional partners are speaking with a bluntness that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. This isn't about one man's personality or Twitter habits, though those matter. This is about structural changes in the global economy, the erosion of post-World War II institutions, and the rise of alternative power centers that no longer need to defer to Washington the way they once did. The fury we're seeing from world leaders reflects a deeper truth. The United States no longer commands the same automatic authority it once wielded, and Trump's return has crystallized that reality in ways that make everyone, including America's closest allies, rethink their strategies going forward. Let's talk about what's really happening here. Because the surface story, angry world leaders, harsh statements, diplomatic tensions, that's just the visible part of something much deeper. When we look at the international response to Trump's return, we have to understand it within the context of a global system that's been unraveling for years, not just since January 2025, but really since the 2008 financial crisis exposed fundamental weaknesses in the neoliberal order that the United States had championed and enforced for decades. Think about the position America held after World War II. It wasn't just military dominance, though that mattered enormously. It was economic supremacy, the dollar as the world's reserve currency, control over international institutions like the IMF and World Bank, the ability to set terms for global trade. American presidents could make demands, impose sanctions, restructure entire economies, and the rest of the world had limited options but to comply or face severe consequences. That system worked, from Washington's perspective, because there were no real alternatives. Europe was rebuilding, Japan was rebuilding, China was still largely agrarian. The Soviet Union offered a different model, but not one that could challenge American economic hegemony in the capitalist world. Fast forward to today, and every single one of those conditions has changed. Europe, despite its current struggles, built robust economies and a common currency that offers at least theoretical competition to the dollar. China went from a poor agricultural society to the world's second-largest economy and America's biggest creditor in just 4 decades. We now have alternative payment systems, alternative development banks, alternative trade frameworks that don't run through Washington. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanding to include others, they're not just talking about challenging American dominance, they're actually building the infrastructure to do it. So when European leaders express fury at Trump's policies, when Asian allies publicly question American commitments, when even historically close partners like Canada or Australia speak with unprecedented frankness about their concerns, we have to understand this isn't just about Trump's personal style or his particular policy choices. It's about these leaders recognizing that they now have options they didn't have before. They can criticize Washington more openly because the economic and political costs of doing so have decreased substantially. They're not as dependent on American markets, American security guarantees, American financial systems as they once were. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. When Trump imposes tariffs or threatens trade wars, the traditional response from affected countries would have been negotiation, compromise, maybe some public grumbling, but ultimate compliance. What are we seeing instead? The European Union is preparing retaliatory measures, coordinating with other major economies, exploring ways to bypass American-dominated payment systems. China's response isn't to back down, but to accelerate its own technological development, its Belt and Road infrastructure projects, its efforts to internationalize the yuan. These aren't the actions of countries that feel they have no choice but to accept American dictates. And here's where it gets really interesting from an economic standpoint. The United States is now the world's largest debtor nation. Think about what that means. America runs massive trade deficits, massive budget deficits, and finances all of this by selling treasury bonds, essentially IOUs, to other countries. China alone holds over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. Japan holds similar amounts. These countries are, in effect, lending the United States the money it needs to maintain its military, its social programs, its entire governmental structure. Now, economically speaking, when you're the biggest debtor, your leverage is actually quite limited. You need your creditors more than they need you, especially when those creditors have growing domestic markets and alternative investment opportunities. This is the contradiction at the heart of American power in the 21st century. The United States still has the world's most powerful military, still has enormous cultural influence, still has Silicon Valley and Hollywood and major universities. But the economic foundation that once supported all of that has eroded. American manufacturing, which was the basis of mid-20th century prosperity, has been hollowed out by decades of deindustrialization. The jobs went overseas, the factories closed, entire communities were devastated. We were told this was inevitable, that we were moving to a service economy, a knowledge economy, that this was progress. But what it really meant was that the United States was surrendering the productive capacity that had made it the world's dominant economic power. Now, Trump campaigned on bringing back manufacturing, on making America great again, on reversing these trends. But here's the problem. You can't simply reverse 40 years of structural economic change with tariffs and tough talk. The global supply chains are integrated in ways that make it nearly impossible to untangle. American corporations have too much invested in overseas production. The cost of rebuilding American manufacturing to compete with countries that have lower labor costs, newer infrastructure, and often more supportive government policies, that cost is enormous, and it's not clear that American capitalism, as currently structured, is willing or able to bear it. So, when world leaders rip into Trump's economic nationalism, when they criticize his tariffs and his threats, part of what they're really saying is, we understand the game better than you do. They know that American companies need access to global markets. They know that American consumers depend on cheap imported goods. They know that the American economy, as currently structured, cannot function in isolation. And they're calling what they see as a bluff. But let's go deeper, because this isn't just about economics. It's also about the moral and political authority that the United States claimed for itself after World War II. America positioned itself as the leader of the free world, the defender of democracy, the champion of human rights. Now we can debate how consistently the United States actually lived up to those ideals. And if we're being honest, the historical record is very mixed at best, but the claim itself had power. It gave American foreign policy a legitimacy beyond just raw military or economic might. That moral authority has been severely damaged, and not just by Trump. It was damaged by the Iraq War, which was sold on false pretenses and led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and regional destabilization. It was damaged by the 2008 financial crisis, which exposed the recklessness and corruption at the heart of American financial capitalism and then spread suffering across the globe while the architects of the crisis faced no real consequences. It was damaged by revelations of mass surveillance, by torture programs, by the failure to address climate change, by the visible increase in inequality and the decay of American democracy itself. When Trump returned to office, many world leaders looked at this and saw not an aberration, but a symptom. They saw a country that elected someone who had already tried to overturn an election, who faced multiple criminal indictments, who openly expressed admiration for authoritarian leaders. From their perspective, how can America lecture the world about democracy when this is what American democracy produces? How can America demand that other countries respect international law when America itself picks and chooses which laws to follow based on convenience? This loss of moral authority matters enormously in international relations because it affects what political scientists call soft power, the ability to shape what other countries want through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion. When America loses soft power, it has to rely more heavily on hard power, on military threats and economic sanctions. But hard power is expensive, it generates resentment, and in a multipolar world with rising powers, it's increasingly difficult to wield effectively. We're seeing this play out in real time. European leaders aren't just angry about specific Trump policies, they're fundamentally reconsidering the transatlantic alliance. They're talking seriously, for the first time in decades, about European strategic autonomy, about building their own military capabilities, about reducing dependence on American security guarantees. French President Macron has spoken explicitly about this. German leaders, traditionally the most Atlanticist in Europe, are having these conversations. This represents a potential historic shift in the global order. In Asia, the dynamics are even more complex. Countries like Japan and South Korea have relied on American military protection for decades, particularly as a counterweight to China. But they're also major trading partners with China, deeply integrated into regional supply chains where China is the dominant player. Trump's transactional approach to alliances, his suggestions that these countries aren't paying enough for American protection, his willingness to meet with North Korea's Kim Jong-un without consulting Seoul, his unpredictability on Taiwan, all of this forces these countries to hedge. They can't abandon the American alliance entirely, not while China's military power continues to grow, but they also can't rely on it the way they once did. And then there's China itself. The fury we're seeing from Chinese leaders toward Trump's policies is rooted in something very specific. China spent the last 40 years playing by the rules of the American-led international order. They joined the World Trade Organization. They liberalized their economy in certain ways. They became integrated into global capitalism. And in the process, they lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and became an economic superpower. From Beijing's perspective, they succeeded at the game Washington set up. And now, just as they're approaching potential parity with the United States, Washington wants to change the rules, wants to contain China's rise, wants to decouple economically and build walls. Chinese leaders see this as fundamentally unfair, and they're not entirely wrong. If the United States truly believed in free market capitalism and open competition, it would accept that China played the game well and won significant market share. But of course, it was never really about free markets or fair competition. It was about maintaining American dominance. And when that dominance is threatened, the commitment to the supposed rules gets abandoned very quickly. This is why the international response to Trump is so intense and why it's likely to persist regardless of who occupies the White House in the future. We're living through a transition from a unipolar world where the United States was the sole superpower to a multipolar world where power is distributed among several major centers. This kind of transition is historically very dangerous. The declining hegemon often lashes out, trying to preserve its position. Rising powers push for changes to the system that reflect their new status. Miscalculation becomes more likely. The risk of conflict increases. World leaders understand this danger, and many of them are genuinely frightened by what they see as American recklessness under Trump. They worry about what happens if the United States abandons its traditional alliances, if it becomes purely transactional in its international relationships, if it embraces nationalism and protectionism fully. They worry about the vacuum that would create, about whether China would fill that vacuum, about what kind of international order would emerge. But here's what's crucial to understand. The anger and the criticism we're seeing from world leaders isn't going to reverse these trends. The structural changes in the global economy, the rise of new powers, the erosion of American dominance, these are long-term historical processes that go far beyond any individual leader or any particular policy. Trump accelerates certain aspects of these changes, makes them more visible, removes some of the diplomatic niceties that obscured them. But he didn't create them, and his potential departure wouldn't resolve them. What we're witnessing is the painful adjustment to a new global reality. The United States is still powerful, still influential, but no longer hegemonic in the way it was. Other countries have more room to maneuver, more ability to resist, more alternatives to choose from. And they're exercising that autonomy in ways that Washington finds deeply uncomfortable. The fury from world leaders reflects their recognition that they now have the power to push back, to criticize, to pursue their own interests, even when those conflict with American preferences. That's what turning the tables really means, not that America has suddenly become weak or irrelevant, but that the automatic deference, the assumption of American leadership, the willingness to subordinate their own interests to Washington's vision, that era is ending. And no amount of anger from Washington, no amount of America First rhetoric, no amount of tariffs or threats is going to bring it back.